Okay, so today I am speaking about advanced front-end architecture in Drupal 8 using Sass, Gulp, and Living Style Guides in your project. So my company is Foster Interactive, and we really are a front-end focused company. We like to implement reasonably complex user interfaces and kind of figure out how we can build those in a sustainable way, which is really what I'm going to be talking about today. We love working with other dev teams, end clients as well, marketing folks and that kind of thing to implement sites. And so I help run the Toronto Drupal user group. And I also created a Sass meetup, which I swear we'll have a meetup soonish on that. So the Sass meetup really more focuses on just pure front-end technology outside of Drupal specific world, which the vast majority of this presentation is going to be that technology and just sort of how you can get it into Drupal. So for better or for worse, front-end development that we've been doing has gotten really complex, and it's only getting more complex. I kind of remember a few years ago, I'm like, once we figure out this responsive thing, then maybe it will be a little less complicated. That never happened. It's just all kinds of new technologies and approaches have been consistently going into the workflow of what we're doing. So we need to have layouts that adapt to different sizes of screens. The websites we build are over a whole range of internet connections, so we need to optimize them to make sure that they run really quickly. And then on top of this, the ecosystem that our websites are running in, the ecosystem itself grows and evolves over time, so we definitely need to figure out a way where we can build our websites where the website itself can evolve to support new platforms as they come out. And so a big problem with these very complicated websites that we're starting to sort of build and work on is that you can actually, there's so much that goes into the front end of your website that it's hard to remember what all those pieces are that you actually build. And so that's bad enough for an individual, but as soon as you start having a team, then different team members being aware of what's actually being constructed in the website becomes harder and harder as they get more complicated. And really, frankly, this is also applicable to solo developers working on their own projects, because you look at your own code that's a year old and it is really easy to forget you built something. And so what we kind of noticed in our projects would be that inside of a project we would start reinventing the wheel. So a little while later you need to add a new component into your project. You'd kind of forget that it's pretty darn similar to a component or user interface element that already existed in your project, and you'd make it from scratch. And really now you've got two nearly identical things inside of your website. Bad from a user interface point of view because it's better if it's consistent. Bad from a performance point of view because now you've got more bloat inside of your front-end code. And bad from a maintenance point of view because now you've got two separate things that you need to take care of and maintain. Say you want to change that style a little bit, now you've got to change it in two places. So to deal with this, we created a toolkit that is sort of our starter project for our company called mainspring.io. So this will just link over to our GitHub page where we have the code base in there. And what Mainspring really is it's a front-end toolkit, a collection of software and tools and conventions that we use to kick off our projects. And so it's important to understand that Mainspring is not a Drupal theme at all. It's something that we use to build our Drupal themes from scratch when we work on our projects. So there's really three major components that are what go into Mainspring. The first is a number of Gulp or Node tasks that automate a bunch of repetitive things that we do on our projects. The second is a highly opinionated Sass and CSS architecture. So that's sort of file structure, naming of files, naming of CSS classes, and sort of the patterns we use inside of our project. And then the last component is to include a living style guide, which is a sort of documentation of your front-end front-end code in a way so that we can keep track of the things that we've actually built. So you can kind of think of that as like Mainspring gives you a blank or a vanilla version of the Bootstrap, UI tool set, and then you build up your own custom Bootstrap for each project, for each client-specific needs, including only the tools and user interface components you actually need for a project and not ones that you don't. So it's a whole bunch of non-Drupal tools, smart folks working in the web world, but not in the Drupal world, assembled in a way to be Drupal friendly, to work inside of our themes. And internally for our company, sort of what the rule is if we think that 80% of our websites could use some cool tool we read out in a blog or something like that, and it goes into Mainspring. So at the end of our at the end of any build we kind of do an audit of all the things we added into the project and just take a quick double check, and we're like, yeah, is this going to be useful for another project? And if we're like, yeah, most of the time, then we add it into Mainspring. Occasionally we'll add in things that don't pass the 80% rule if they generate no CSS. So they won't add any bloat to your project, then we'll be a little more liberal about what we include. So as you are listening to this presentation, at the end of the day, what Mainspring is doing is basically generating CSS and some HTML for your style guide and dealing with some JavaScript stuff. So you might think this is the world's most complicated way of getting to what's, at the end of the day, or certainly in the past, used to be pretty straightforward, just some CSS and HTML. That's fine, each of their own. For us, it works well for our projects. But really, what we've done is published Mainspring as an open source repository, so you can dive in and just pick and choose little pieces of that. So use just the gulp tasks, just look at the naming conventions, just look at the style guide, and hopefully those would be useful for you inside of your own project. Another major motivation for sort of creating this project and releasing it, other than just building everything faster, is when we were trying to learn how to do all these things. It's been a couple years of learning how to integrate Sass and then Gulp and all this stuff into our workflows. It was really hard. You'd get lots of good blog posts that were on a specific individual topic, so like how to run a Gulp task of some kind. You get that blog post done that covers that one sort of task, but how to actually integrate it into a larger workflow and how all the pieces, all the cogs in the machine sort of come together in a project was really tricky for us. So I remember like John Albums is a Drupal front-end sort of expert that's well known in the community, and I'd watch his presentations and literally like pause the screenshot that shows the file structure of his theme, and I'd be like, how's he naming them all? And like zoom in, and our teams would just to learn patterns that other people use to understand where they're coming from. So you can just download everything and take a look there and see the patterns that are in there. So how do we install Mainspring? It's actually start off with presumably a fresh Drupal 8 website. It doesn't have to be Drupal 8. It doesn't have to be Drupal at all. This would work perfectly well in WordPress or Drupal 7 or whatever. But generally speaking, we start off with Drupal 8 sites, and then we just use Drupal console, which is a command line tool for Drupal. If you don't know what it is, definitely go and Google it and check it out. And you just run this command line tool, and it generates a blank new theme in your Drupal website. And we like to use the Drupal base theme stable, which just has the least amount of markup out of all possible options. So like very few classes and stuff like that come when you install a base theme with stable. Because really what we're trying to do is build the entire thing from the ground up out of nothing, because we can control it, understand it, and know how the website's going to evolve.
So stable is something in your project, right?
No, stable is the base theme that comes with Drupal 8 core. Oh. And there's two base themes, stable and classy. And so there's this two different major schools of thought about how theming ought to go from a base theme point of view inside of the Drupal community. And some people want sensible base classes that are sort of stable, and like there's some consensus about what those base classes should be and how they should be written. And that's the classy theme. And then stable theme is literally Drupal's raw markup with the bare minimum number of classes required for it to function with the core contrib modules in it. And basically what stable theme will also do is if Drupal changes what, like the theme functions change the output that they're going to generate, base themes make the base theme stable, make sure they remain consistent over time. And so you definitely should be building any custom Drupal modules on either classy or stable. And for us, we like the sort of nothing theme to be our starting point. So how to get started is actually really simple. Go to the project page and download the zip of the project. Do not clone out Mainspring into your theme. And then you just unzip it there. And the reason you want to do that and not maintain sort of a Git relationship is really this is like a boilerplate starter project. So once you get it running and start modifying it, you're never going to want to go back to the original source and like update it or anything. If something cool new comes out in Mainspring in a couple months, you might pick and choose that file and copy it into your project, but you're never really going to want to upgrade a core Mainspring install. And so at some point in the future, we might make Mainspring into like use Human or one of those tools that sort of, as a command line tool, we ask you a couple questions and it generates all this Mainspring sort of starter files inside of your theme. But at this point, that's a heck of a lot of work, and unzipping it works just fine. So once you have that inside of your base theme, you just go into command line, jump over to your base theme, and run npm install. And I'm kind of assuming you have Node.js installed on your local machine. If you don't, Mainspring's got documentation inside of the README that links to documentation files and how to get that installed. What Node.js npm install command is going to do is it's going to look at your config.json file that's sitting in the root of the folder. And inside of there, we've loaded a whole whack of tools that we like to use as our starting point for our project. So it's going to go ahead and download all of those tools and install them into a node modules folder inside of your theme. You do not commit node modules into your repo. The Git ignores will already do all that for you, and basically that's going to install the tools you're going to need to run all the tasks that we have set up in Mainspring. Once you finish that, you run npm shrinkwrap, and that's not showing up on the screen very well. That's --dev that's in there. And what that does is when you first run npm install, the config.json basically downloads the newest versions of all those components that exist right now. And when you run npm shrinkwrap, what that does is it actually says you downloaded exactly this version of every one of those tools, and it saves it to a file so that once you commit that to your repo, and once you do, the next person who does npm install, it's not going to go and get the newest possible versions of all those tools. It's going to get exactly the same version of those tools that were installed whenever someone did npm shrinkwrap. And so that just ensures all your team members are running exactly the same versions of all the modules, node modules inside your front-end sort of dev stack. So the next command is gulp bower, which I'll jump into a little more detail later, but really you just run gulp bower. Bower is yet another package manager thing that downloads third-party tools, and many tools are available in Bower and not available in Node, so that's why we have to use two tools. But basically what this one does is goes and downloads a bunch of Sass tools that we like to use, and a bunch of JavaScript files that'll probably end up being deployed on the actual front end of your website. And then inside of the folder of Mainspring, there's a gulp.js folder, and inside of there is a config.js file. And this is the sort of top of the file. You just need to update two variables. One is the base URL of your website. So you can see mainspring.dev is what our local dev environment for Mainspring would be. And then the second is var style guides extra head. So what this is inside of your living style guide, you might want to add some JavaScript files that show up on the front end of your website into your style guide to make it work. So one of the examples that we did is the accordion script that we have that opens and closes an accordion. If we don't include it in the style guide, you can't click on the accordion inside of the style guide to open and close it. So the bulk of what's in here is gulp tasks. The first section of this presentation I'm going to talk about is all gulp tasks. So just from a folder structure point of view, there's a gulp.js file sitting in the root of the project That's not really doing too much. It's just basically going and loading all the other content inside of the gulp.js folder. Really all you need to pay attention to is edit the config.js file inside of there, and there's those 2 required settings. There's also like a million configuration settings inside of there that all have what I think are reasonable defaults, but you might want to read through and adjust to your liking. And then inside of there, there's a gulp.js task folder, which is each individual file is one of the gulp automation tasks that I'll go over in a second. And so really what we've tried to do is break up the tasks into discrete separate files so you can kind of like, understand one small file as opposed to having one gigantic gulp file that's difficult to understand. So the first task, gulp bower. So you get all this stuff installed and run gulp bower from the command line inside of your theme. What's that doing is it's going and looking at this file called bower.json, which is the manifest file of all the third-party libraries you want to download. Goes ahead and runs bower inside of Node, and basically goes and downloads a bunch of third-party libraries, dumps it into a Bower components folder. Then it knows which are the main files from these projects that you actually need, like the jQuery, jQuery UI or something like that you want to include in your project. Copies them out of Bower components into a JS/vendor folder. And then it goes ahead and it makes a minified identical copy to those files. So basically just one command goes and gets all your libraries. You end up with an uncompressed and a compressed version of them right next to each other. Why do you want the uncompressed files? Well, sometimes debugging JavaScript is a heck of a lot easier to have an uncompressed source sitting next to it for debugging purposes. So again, another really sort of simple task, gulp images. Again, it's looking in this /images-source folder, goes ahead and losslessly compresses all the images that are in there with a tool called ImageMin, so it somehow just gets rid of junk in the files that it doesn't actually need to render, but if you export your files from Photoshop, it's going to add that crap in. And then it nags at you if that file is too big. So you can define what too big means. I think by default we set ours to like 70K or something like that. And then it warns you if the file size are too big, so helps prevent you accidentally putting in a too big a source file inside of there, and then dumps it out to the images output folder. Saslint, this is my very favorite tool. Saslint is like the strict parent of coding conventions that nags at you when your code is not exactly and precisely a very specific way. So this isn't actually checking for errors in your Sass code. This is like you define a very strict set of like the order of every CSS element that's the way for your project, how white spaces should be taken care of, all these really nitpicky details, and this tool sort of nags at you when you do not obey the rules as far as syntax and those kinds of things. And so you can see this example here. This is that's a placeholder element that's appearing at the top. It's highlighted the end of line 16 because there is no space between core and the open bracket. Border color and border style are highlighted because they are not in the correct order that we've defined in the file for how every CSS element should appear. And in the case of the function next to border radius, there are 2 spaces there that should not be there. And so this is actually running in Sublime. There's many plugins for many text editors where you can see these things inside of the editor. It also runs inside of the command line as well and presents those warnings. So you basically make this very nitpicky set of rules, agree with your team what the rules are, and then it makes sure, just like every little thing, you're going to get these warnings every time you run gulp saslint, and it tells you exactly which files and where have syntax problems inside of them. So you can see this last example, even C button big, capital B big, should be written in a different syntax. So it's nagging me that I named the class not according to the patterns of spaces and hyphens and stuff within our project. So this is really awesome because as you work on your projects, they become consistent between different people who work on the same project, and even your own projects over time, right? Because you're going to start your last project with the same config you had before. Maybe you slowly evolve it or whatever, but if we have a project now and a project a year from now, exactly how they're structured for every little element is going to be nearly identical for over time. And so the settings for this are in the sas.lint, sas-lint.yaml in the root of the project. Another one, gulp-lint, so basically identical, right? Looks in your JavaScript folder. It has to actually filter out all those vendor files we downloaded in Bower inside of there, and it filters out the minified versions because we've got, similar to SASLint, we've defined our white spaces and naming conventions for all of our JavaScript files, which by default in Mainspring are Drupal's JavaScript conventions. And so obviously our minified files are going to be on one line with no spaces and stuff, so they wouldn't match. It would complain about every one of those files. So we ignore those, and then we paste out a message to nag when they're not exactly the formats that we line up. Also works inside of your code editor and in the command line itself. And now onto the main stuff, right? Like the whole purpose of this ultimately is to take SAS files, a bunch of small SAS partials, in sort of coder-friendly, organized chunks of code so that it's easy to work with as possible, and then end up with a highly optimized machine compressed code for one performant style CSS file. So we use libsas, which there are two flavors of the SAS compilers. Well, there's more than two, but two main ones, libsas and rubysas. SAS originally was written in Ruby, but now libsas and rubysas, libsas is the C version of the compiler that renders SAS into CSS. And so they have feature parity now. In the past, the rubysas used to have better features, but now they're exactly the same. And the libsas version runs approximately 10 times faster than Ruby, so there's absolutely no reason to use the Ruby version of SAS unless you happen to be working on a Ruby project and already have the stack running. So basically another advantage of having many, the general concept is we have many small partials that get compiled out, and another advantage of that is that if you have multiple developers working on a single project, and you're working in version control, it is less likely that two people are working on the same file, so you end up with fewer conflicts in version control. So this is the CSS compile task inside of Mainspring. It's just gulp css::dev. There's like a prod version of this where it makes everything minified, but this is sort of the developer-friendly version of it. And it just looks for all the SCSS files that are in your SCSS folder, so that's the SAS files inside of there. Generates source maps for you. So because SAS is a compiled language and your CSS is this like minified one line of spaceless code to sort of make it as efficient as possible, if you inspect that in the inspector, it's completely useless to try and you inspect an element to figure out how to change it. Source maps define the relationship between the SAS partials and the output. So once you have source maps working, and they just work in Chrome and Firefox and most browsers, you can inspect on the element and it tells you the source partial that was used to affect those styles rather than the SAS output itself. It of course then compiles the CSS inside of the folder. It uses a tool called Auto Prefixer, which is really cool. It will automatically add the vendor prefixes you need for your project to your CSS after the CSS is compiled. So you can kind of configure. You go in the file and you say, I want to support last two versions of IE or whatever. It will actually look at your code, which you write in proper CSS3 spec, 2-spec code, and then it's going to automatically add those vendor prefixes just for the browsers that you define as your requirements for your project as well. So basically the advantage is you never have to think about a vendor prefix ever again, which I'm happy to never do that again. And it nags at you if your file's too big, so it's easy to accidentally make huge bloated files using SAS. It has loops, so you could make a nearly endless loop and generate a gigantic file. So it'll warn you if your CSS output is too big. And then it lints your files to make sure it adheres to coding standards and outputs your file. So another big piece of what Mainspring does is it helps you deal with SVG graphics. So SVGs are scalable vector graphics, and so why they are very useful is because they're vector. They can scale to any resolution. You get your high DPI displays. They will scale beautifully and have nice sharp edges. And so primarily we use them for icons and sets of icons inside of our projects. As an alternative, the alternative method is to use icon fonts. And in my opinion, SVGs are superior to icon fonts for a couple of reasons. First, you can control the graphics in a way such that both icon fonts and SVGs can be have their color controlled with just CSS. But with SVGs, you could control more than one color at a time inside of a single icon, and with CSS itself, which is something that icon fonts can't do. The second and really important reason is that they are accessible. So SVG graphics have a way of basically like embedding the equivalent of an alt tag right in your SVG graphic. And so because of that, it's much better from an accessibility point of view, because icon fonts are basically like randomly displaying weird characters, like weird symbols, and then swapping those out with fonts where they're like, this weird symbol is this character in a font. And that is terrible from an accessibility point of view. So really our approach for this as well, and another good thing about SVGs as well, is we create what's called an SVG sprite. And so you take a bunch of smaller SVGs and combine them together in one giant file. And that is cacheable by the browser, so very useful for performance. So what a sprite looks like, and basically SVGs are an XML-ish kind of file format, and inside of basically you could do this manually if you wanted to. You could open up an SVG file and see a bunch of XML stuff in there, copy that into a new file, and just put a little tag called a symbol. And you could just paste multiple different SVG files and wrap each one of them with a symbol tag inside of one SVG file, and that basically would make an SVG sprite. And how you would use that SVG sprite is an example here. You can see the SVG class inside of the first sort of link, and it says use, and it's pointing to this file, spritesocial.svg, and then you see the hashtag Facebook, which is saying there is some symbol inside of this file called Facebook pasted in here in the DOM inside of this layout. And you can see the second example where there's Twitter showing up inside of the SVGUs as well. So one file could have two different icons, and then this is how you call them to sort of get those icons to render inside of the display. Diving into SVGs is well outside of the scope of this talk. I have a link at the bottom here that points to a 2.5-hour SAS meetup workshop that goes through the nuance of how to actually get all this stuff to work. But really what I want to focus on here is how Mainspring, you need to understand the process behind how all this stuff works, but what Mainspring does is takes this really nitpicky pain in the ass process of creating sprites and kind of automates everything for you. So when you install Mainspring and run gulp svg sprite, the first thing it does is delete your SVG folder. So this is like the output folder. So because the idea is you're going to be working on a project and changing and updating it over time, you might rename icons, you might delete icons and replace them with other ones. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that our output is clean and regenerated from scratch every time you run this command. It then looks in your SVG source file, so just if you're working with it, make sure you put your icons in the source and not the output folder. And it looks for SVGs hanging out in there, and it looks for folders holding SVGs inside of there. It then takes all those files and strips out all color attributes out of them. So SVGs have stroke and fill attributes that you can attach to sort of the shapes that are defined inside of an SVG. But if you have those in your SVG output, you can't override the color of the shapes with CSS because it's kind of like it's more specific and embedded in the file. So we strip all that stuff out and copy it to an identical output folder, which is the SVG output folder. So now you have all exactly the same files. They're minified, so it gets rid of the crap that Illustrator comments and stuff like that will add in and have no color. So then another step happens where it looks inside of that folder and it sees anything that it sees as a subfolder. It takes all the sprites inside of that subfolder, all of the individual icon files inside of that subfolder, combines them together and makes one sprite, and then names that sprite after the name of the folder and puts it in the root. So what that's going to do is that sprite will then have every icon file that you just happen to put in a folder all automatically sort of sprited together, and the name of the ID, where you saw where I did hashbang Twitter or a number sign Twitter previously, was the name of the SVG file. So it just sort of takes this laborious pain in the ass process of creating this stuff, and you just put icons in a folder and run the command, and then it's done, and it's optimized, and it's there, and that's easy to do. So another example of this idea of why it's in folders and creating sprites as well is, say you work on your project and you got the front end code all done and you make a bunch of sprites, but maybe you have like a registered user area of the project which have different icons that you need. Probably doesn't make sense to like put too many icons in one humongous sprite, because it will grow over time, especially if some users will never need those registered user icons or whatever. So I might make a second registered user folder, like user sprite or something like that, and just dump different icons in there, run the command once, you're done. Now you can reference that second file. So it's really a big time saver on
Let's
this.
just say too that one of my favorite things is the cleaning up from Illustrator.
Yeah.
So no matter what's that crap stuff, it just
Yeah.
and remove things up. That's awesome.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. So another tool that's in the stack, Browser Sync. So this is incredibly useful. This is my super contrived example of what you could do to run Browser Sync. What Browser Sync does is it runs a proxy server inside of your computer, and then you can connect all your devices to your proxy server inside of just running off your local host. And basically what happens is it follows along with all these websites. So if I picked up that phone and started scrolling around on the phone, all the connected browsers that would be there would be scrolling up and down at the same time. I tap on one of those things, it's going to go to that page in that browser in all of them, which is awesome. What else it does is, if it's configured properly, when you save your file, you don't need to press refresh on these browsers. It will automatically refresh the browsers. If HTML changes, it will do a proper refresh. If only CSS changes, it actually pushes it to the browser without refreshing the page, which is amazing, because say you're working on the footer of your website, the refresh takes you back to the top of the page, which is annoying. So it can actually refresh just inline inside of the components. So very useful. This is a contrived example. I would actually say run a tablet on Android or whatever, and run a phone, like a phone-sized device. When I'm actually doing theming, just have two different form factors, two different OSs running, just attached to your dev environment. And what you're going to discover is you're going to find browser-specific glitches way faster while you're coding, which is so much faster than finding them in QA and reporting them and having them discovered later. So just an incredibly useful tool. So how does this stuff all come together, right? There's a whole bunch of these tasks that come together, and really this is the Gulp Watch task. So if you're this is the task we run all the time when we're doing web development. Basically what happens is, if you press save on any file, on any SAS partial inside of your SAS folder structure, it's going to start this task and automatically wait for you to press save. It's going to compile your CSS. It's going to render your style guide. It's going to refresh all your browsers, and then it's going to lint your SAS to make sure it adheres to our obsessively detailed standards of what that code should look like. So really we take what is, 20 minutes of explaining a bunch of complicated tasks and just automatically run them anytime you press save on any file. And so really have the advantage of catching bugs and errors while you're creating them. Also some performance, catching performance issues as they happen. So this kind of takes us to the second chunk of what Mainspring's all about, and this is the CSS architecture component. And so these are a number of different, very popular naming patterns that are used in the Drupal community. SMACS stands for Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS, created by Jonathan Snook. And so another pattern is known as BEM, which stands for Block Element Modifier. And then there's, of course, the Drupal 8 coding standards, which basically takes these two standards and kind of glues them together. And that's defined how we like to code things in Drupal 8. There are numerous other naming standards that are out there. Atomic design is one that comes to mind. Object-oriented CSS is another. What's not important is specifically which coding standard you use, but more that your team agrees to a coding standard, that you program your linter to actually enforce your coding standard, and that everyone works with that same approach, because it allows different people to understand each other's code faster, which allows us to spend more time actually doing the act of building websites rather than trying to figure out what the hell you did a year ago or what someone else on your team did. So Mainspring is kind of based off of the Drupal 8 coding standards, but it kind of pushes them a little bit further. But the principles which are behind the Drupal 8 coding standards are definitely important and applicable. So, basically by doing all this, we want to make sure that our code is predictable. It means it's consistent and understandable as part of our code base. And we can also make a change to it and know that it's not going to have unforeseen side effects somewhere else in the website. We want to make sure that our code is reusable so that we can make new elements from existing elements quickly and easily. We need to make sure that it's maintainable, so it's easy to add, modify, and extend what we already have without needing to refactor a bunch of things or accidentally breaking components. And finally, we need to make sure it's scalable. So it needs to be something that can work for a solo developer working on their own project, as well as a larger team coordinating and working together. So this is, and again, this is kind of like, you could have a whole other presentation on naming stuff and naming conventions, which, as I was mentioning, John Album's presentation is just on this, but the basics of BEM is block, element, and modifier. And so the idea is the block is like your core component element, your core user interface chunk. The element is like a sub piece of that user interface, and a modifier is a variation in there. And so in Drupal world, calling things blocks is super confusing, so we have all agreed to call it a component instead of a block. And so you can see the example at the bottom. We've got a site search component, which might be that widget with the field you type in and a magnifying glass icon that you click to actually submit your search. So you could have site search _field, which would actually be the text input, and site search _full. So maybe there's the little mini one on your website, and maybe there's a larger one that has some advanced options or something like that in it. So we keep that same principle in our naming conventions, but sort of push them a little bit. So we've got 5 main folders as how we organize our structure inside of Mainspring. The first are globals, and so basically what we do is we take, there's a guy, Harry Roberts, who's an awesome, he's got an awesome blog post on, I was on the previous slide, on how to understand BEM naming conventions. But we borrowed one of his conventions where you actually add a letter prefix to the front of your class names, which tells you which folder that particular class is going to live. So the globals all start with G- on those items, and the globals represent like site-wide elements, so those core elements like typography, titles, images, tables, just a generic element that could be used anywhere throughout your website. You could also think about it about the stuff that you put into a WYSIWYG editor, that your users are actually going to input in the WYSIWYG editor is another way to think of what would be a good global element, because it's those core fundamental HTML elements in your site. Next one is components. So this is exactly the same as Drupal 8's coding standards. They say make a components folder and put all your UI elements inside of there. What is a little different is we prefix it with C- on the front of it so you can identify it more easily. So you could imagine buttons, obviously a common element in sites. We came up with an example card, so that Google material design kind of thing, probably with a picture, a little blurb, and a couple buttons on it. That might be a card, an accordion menu, click to expand, that kind of thing, or menus or navigations in your website. Layout is the next folder. So layout position your components and organize how they're arranged inside of the interface on your site. So layout.page might be your like page wrappers and the outer edges of your site, so to speak. Then you might have a separate partial that holds just the headers and maybe you're positioning your logo, have a navigation in there, and then when you hit a certain break on smaller size displays, it's like a hamburger menu. And as the browser gets larger, it turns into a horizontal menu, something like that. All the styles that will control that kind of those kinds of level of detail would appear in a single partial like header. And then there's two examples here of layout 2 call and layout 4 call. These might be like generic column layouts that you use in multiple different places around your website, and you want to be able to reuse them. There's lots of places where you might want to have multiple different amounts of columns inside of your site. Utility classes, so these are kind of like one-trick pony sort of classes that don't neatly fit inside of any of the other categories. So like clear fixes, or we have classes to make, you hide the text visually from the screen, but it's still available to text readers, so like an accessible way of hiding text inside of that. So you might do something like have a Facebook icon on your website, but if you focused on that inside of a screen reader, it would say like on Facebook or follow on Facebook or whatever. But for sighted users, it just shows the Facebook icon. And finally, vendor folder. That's where we take our random third-party stuff and dump it in there. The Sass linter ignores the vendor folder. So it's basically if you're using like jQuery UI widgets, contrib modules that come with their own CSS you want to keep, we comment it out of our theme file so that it doesn't load separately into Drupal in a randomish sort of order. And you copy the CSS into your vendor folder, rename it .scss, and now usually there's a whole bunch of crap in there that you don't need. So like if you just comment out the stuff you don't need, hack the stuff you want to keep, and just dump it into your vendor folder if you're short on time. It is better to refactor that stuff into proper naming conventions elsewhere, but sometimes that's not practical in a project. So this is all super, yes?
So you went out, or just you get rid of all of the vendor, whatever comes from like a module that puts in its own whatever, you copy, move
You can go in your theme file and you unset it.
or drop it in there, but you don't use any of the whatever comes with.
So we'll use like admin stuff that, content editor, we won't bother refactoring stuff that affects content editors, but assuming, your actual core users, whether they're anonymous or logged in or whatever, usually there's something you want to change inside of that CSS. So most of the time we will unset it, copy it over to the vendor folder, and actually, modify it to our specifications. Because like, you might want to change colors and stuff like that. It's better to go and change the colors in there rather than like write another CSS declaration after it that's more specific that overrides the default colors in there. Like, we're doing all this work to.
Once in a while, not
It's pretty rare for the CSS to, like from a contrib module to like change in a fundamental way, but yes, absolutely. Every now and then it's a pain in the ass. That's why we don't delete all the code in there. We comment it out, and you just leave it in there and take good notes on what you hacked. So this is all super abstract and difficult to understand, so it's much easier to show with pictures. So we're looking at, this is Enercare, a website we put together, and sort of just, this is a creative comp of it, and these are sort of an idea of some of the components. So we've got main menu component highlighted blue. We made this element called a masthead component, which is these large banner items in there. And then we made this thing called action components. Basically we want you to do something and click through and engage with it. So that's why we called them actions. And you can see that our Sass file structure, so these would all be inside of the components folder, are all named based off of what the component looks like in the user interface. We are not naming things based off of whether they're generated from views or what contrib generates them or whatever. It's what the interface looks like controls what these components are. And so each component is like a discrete element that if you wanted to, you could reuse it throughout your website. And then you can see this example at the bottom where actions, when we started working on this website, we started out with a pretty straightforward thing. but then over time it evolved where there's like a horizontal variation of actions and all this stuff. So the actual number of lines of code to define that in that particular file kind of grew, you know, more than 200 lines or whatever. And so we started splitting out those components into subcomponents. So you got one small file where you can kind of look at and digest the whole file in a single glance. And you know, you can focus on one thing at a time without needing to sort of keep in your mind a number of different components. So for example, inside of that action component would be some styles that said, when the action is small, it's in one column, and as you stretch your browser wider, at some point it's going to stack into a 2-column wide component. So here's a different example on a different website we put together. Again, just to sort of highlight what the process is for identifying how you figure out how to break your website, you know, all this user interface into sort of smaller discrete chunks. So what's highlighted in blue here are our global elements, and basically, you know, how we go through this process. We sit down as a team, look at the creative comps, draw a bunch of boxes on it, and be like, sort of argue about, is this thing global? Is it like a component? Is it a layout? And so what we're seeing here is, you know, that giant headline up top and typography, so H1s, H2s, definitely consistent across your website. We got large callout font that's showing in the middle there. In green, we've got our components highlighted, so logos, main nav, secondary nav, button icons. We made this thing, we called this thing a highlight. That's these little icons and text messages sort of pairing and sort of buttons below. Layouts. So our header layouts inside of there, the logo, primary and secondary nav, those shift around at different breakpoints. Header content centered, so you can see that's a variation because in this website most of the stuff, most of the titles were left aligned, but this was a place where it's centered. And so we're really identifying all the different pieces of the website before we start coding. We name everything before we start coding. And that way we can sort of sit down and get a couple, you know, you can kind of go through this exercise relatively quickly with your team and kind of get some consensus on what makes sense. Inside of your project, things are going to change a little bit, and you might be like, you know, new creative comes, you're like, oh, now this thing's used in this other place, and I thought it, you know, you might turn a component into a global thing later. But generally, this is really, really helpful for making sure that you think with and are attentive about how you name things inside your website, because it makes all of your code easier to understand and maintain forever. So it's worth putting in the effort up front. So all these elements, as you start coding, starts fleshing out these different partials that show up in our core folder libraries. And you know, if we think about it, like, why bother doing all this work to name things, organize things, structure things? Well, at the end of the day, in this website, I could inspect it with Chrome or whatever and look at the class name of any element inside of that website, and I could tell you what folder and what file I would need to open to go and change that element. And that's without using the source inspector to actually figure it out. So it's basically what we're trying to do is organize our website so that you can actually comprehend the incredible complexity that goes into websites these days without, you know, we still have the dev tools to help, but it's better if you don't need the dev tools to understand how they're structured. Another cool benefit of having this sort of Hungarian notation prefix thing on your class names is if you have an IDE or text editor that does code hinting, and this is an example of Harry Roberts, who uses a little bit of a different naming convention, but same idea. You can see that the code hinter, as you start typing, is going to show the text names of all the different elements that you've already created inside of your project. So it's yet another way to kind of help remember what you've already built as you're working through your project. So of course, we've got these complicated sort of processes to output essentially CSS at the end of the day, but we've got this organizational structure as well, which does a second job, which generates the documentation of all the user interface elements inside of our CSS using style guides. And so really what we're trying to do is maintain our code output on the front end output in the same files as the documentation so that we can keep it and maintain it over time. So the style guide generator that I love is called SC5. SC5 is when inside of Mainspring by default, it will be generated into the /style guide folder. That is, of course, configurable, and SC5 is built on top of KSS Node, which is probably the most popular one in the Drupal universe. John Albums is a maintainer on that project. And so basically what it has KSS Node as a dependency for it to run, but it has a couple killer features that I really like that I think are worth using this tool as opposed to sort of pure KSS Node. It is actually an Angular app, this website that's generated as well, so that's kind of a neat feature, but there is a consequence of that in that if, because it's like live rendering the DOM, just make sure when you're using this, you install an app that, install one of those add-ons that disables your cache, because it's going to be like live rendering JSON files without page refreshes, and so all kinds of weird things happen. If you're working on, that live local dev mode where it's refreshing, it's regenerating all of this style guide every time you press save and updating the browser. So just make sure you disable your cache, or else really bizarre and frustrating things will happen. And it's happened to me many, many times, so it's easy to forget. And so if you want to see the output of vanilla Mainspring, it's just got some, like, again, those elements that are like 80% of our projects use these elements. You can go to demo-mainspring.io. And so basically what comes out of Mainspring is basically a vanilla sort of starter to get you started in creating something like your own Bootstrap from scratch, and a whole bunch of documentation about our naming conventions and getting started inside of there. And documentation is really important for understanding your project in the long run, but writing documentation really sucks, so it's helpful to have a bunch of documentation there for you to start from. So I'm showing, this is a video of a screen grab of using the output inside of SC5. And you can see on the left, those are all the user interface components. And it's generating the buttons, and there's some icon-y buttons in there. And all the variations of the buttons that are loaded into the project are represented there. What's really cool about it is, which is an enhancement on KSS Node, is that you see it's generating the pseudo classes in there. So I just say, I want to show the button in its hover state. It actually like flat renders that to your CSS file, which shows up inside of your style guide. So you don't need to actually hover over the button to see what it's going to hover. And so that's a really cool feature that's incredibly useful. It also embeds your CSS partials like directly inside of there, so you can see it, which is also very awesome. Yeah.
So this is built on SCSS. Where are you finding the templates for those components?
The components are, so I'll go over that in a sec, but to generate the actual markup that is HTML markup, except it's Angular, whatever, but the HTML that is there is actually you put comments inside of your SCSS partials, and it reads those comments, and then it generates that entire website guide directly out of comments that are in there. The other feature that, which I kind of missed there, I don't know how to jump around. Anyway, this button here is a little expand behavior where you can, any of the elements inside of your style guide, you can press that button and it will open it full screen without the rest of the style guide interface inside of there. And you can see just that element on its own inside of the layout. And why that's useful is you might have a pretty complicated layout where the rest of the browser window might not like go wide enough for you to actually see the full range of layout controls or something like that inside of the website. So it's useful to isolate it and just see it in a nothing frame with that element inside of there. The other thing that's really useful for is if you use visual regression testing tools. So these are the tools that will take a screen grab of your website, and then you make changes to it later, and it takes a screen grab of your website, and it notices if anything's different, and will report that as an error or a change. If you use a tool like this, you can actually point the tool at the isolated views of the style guide's individual components, and then you run a test and you make a change and you expect just the components you've changed to sort of show up on the, as fails on this visual regression test. So it's really useful to sort of just test little pieces of your interface in an automated way. Another feature that's useful that because it's, oh, I think this is, no, I missed one. This one. So because it's an Angular app, you can get this sort of live search feature that's in there. Let's see. Play,
I
please.
was switching the tables before. Is that the one you mean?
Yes. So let's, do I have the right video up here? No, this is the wrong video. Let me just. I'll swear I'll get this right one of these times. Okay, there we go. So you can just use the search box and start typing the name of the components that you've got in your style guide, and it's going to dynamically load and magically find those. So that's kind of a nice side effect of a cool Angular app approach inside of there. And then finally, I think this is really cool as well, is it understands the Sass variables that you used in your Sass sort of partial structure. And so you can see I'm looking at the colors, the global color component. There's only two, black and white, defined in there. But you can see it actually knows those are the Sass variables that I used to define what black and white colors happen to be. I press the button to say show all the Sass variables in my project. So it's going and finding every single Sass variable inside of that. And then you can click on them and see which parts of your style guide are actually rendered using that particular variable. So we can see I use base font size is something we use all over the place in our base HTML sort of definitions inside of there. And it also shows up inside of images as these two particular components, which each have their own Sass partial file, is where that variable is being used. So this is the format that you do to generate the entire website. These are comments that appear inside of your Sass partials, inside of your website. What we're seeing here, and this is KSS notation, which to be honest, I am not a big fan of KSS notation. I think it's kind of odd and finicky, but the incredible power of the output offsets the oddities in the syntax. So I definitely think it's worthwhile doing. And so just this line of, just these lines of code here generates that entire section of the style guide on the left. So this is an example of the button component inside of the websites. And you can see, so this is white space, case, and needing blank space sensitive. So you've got a block of comments which need to be in that, the double hyphen comment format. The first line inside of your comment block generates the title of the component inside of your style guide. The last line, which must have no extra comment lines underneath it and must have a blank line above it, and must be capital S in style guide, is defining where in the hierarchy this item appears. So this basically defines the menu structure inside of your style guide. It needs to be a number. You can use any numbers, but you can basically, 2.1, something like that, you can define. But then you have to have a 2.1 to be able to have a 2.1.1 inside of your structure. And this is where SE5 sort of lost a feature of KSS Node. In KSS Node, there's you can kind of name things. You can name it in the style guide, and it will sort of generate the whole thing for you. In SE5, you have to use numbers. And so really, the next piece of the puzzle is the markup. So you have to do lowercase m, markup colon, and then a soft return. Like if you put an extra line in there, there would be nothing generated. And you put in your HTML markup right inside of there. So that's generating the code, just showing up here and actually being rendered inside of each of those buttons there. And then this last little piece is this sort of special variable that comes from KSS Node, which is the modifiers variable. And this is perhaps the strangest of all the syntax notations inside of there. So that special variable will substitute values. That's what it's designed to do. So you can see how there's like 8 buttons in there. And because there's 8 defined modifiers inside of here, and how a modifier works is you see the beginning C- button. So that's the CSS class, that's the value of the modifier. Then there's a space and a hyphen and a space and the word default. So that's the label that gets applied to the modifier. So it's literally looking for a block of comments that have minuses in them, and that's how it figures out what a list of modifiers is. So it basically knows that that's a list of items, and it generates for each item appearing there, it will generate one instance of the button in the example on the left-hand side. So if you're, so it's, yeah, finicky, like crazy finicky. But
You ever wanted the label before the class, like
it doesn't know what to do.
Yeah.
It doesn't, yeah, so I'd like to do that, but I just write default.
Also,
And
if you create 2 with the same number, it won't
it,
generate the style
it won't
guide.
generate the style guide. There's a little message in there that says,
You,
you have this number twice, but it doesn't tell you where the files are that have the 2 numbers.
after about 5 times refreshing, trying to find, it told me.
Oh, okay. It's like it's like
I was going to tell you that. It was about 5 or 6 times, and it's like a boom.
it understands.
Files.
It
It's like,
understands.
yes.
Yeah, it understands you're angry. So sometimes though your markup is typo. Anyway, sometimes your markup is kind of complicated, not one line of CSS or sorry HTML. So in this case, you can actually save your markup to a separate HTML file. I'd put it next to the partial and name it exactly the same as the partial that's calling it, but that's just our convention. You don't have to do it that way. And it's missing the M on markup. I changed it last minute and got it wrong. Markup, and that's pointing to that HTML file. So an accordion, it's got lots of divs and nested things and JavaScript states, EQ states and stuff, or JavaScript data attributes in there. So that's where you can use that as an external file instead of putting all that markup directly as comments inside your main, inside of your Sass partials. Also kind of nice because it's an HTML file. Your editor is probably going to give you code hinting on HTML files, which of course won't work because those other ones are all Sass files. At least in Sublime, it has no idea what, a little block of HTML and inside of the Sass file, it doesn't give you any code hinting on. The last feature that is also incredibly useful, and this is a unique to SC5 feature, is this special tag SG insert. So I assume that stands for style guide insert. So sometimes you have style guide elements that assemble other pieces of your style guide into sort of more complex pieces. And so when you use SG insert and just reference the style guide number, it goes and gets the markup. So in this case, this is an accordion, and the style guide component, we've got an accordion with an open state, an accordion with a closed state. And so those pieces are assembled together in the whole accordion navigation element as a different part of the style guide. So you can see it's loading in 2.7.2, which is the it's not shown here, but that would be the closed accordion. 2.71 in the middle is the open accordion, followed by a closed accordion. So just by referencing it, by using this special tag, it's going to go and actually embed that code inside of the style guide output. And it's nice because then if you change something about how a component works, you don't need to remember to change it in 2 places. Any of those changes will just automatically cascade out into other parts of your website. So it's a little bit easier to maintain the style guide components inside of there. So that's really it. The main benefits that we have from using something like Mainspring and sort of putting the work in to get this all together is really we've got to improve team velocity on what we're working on. We end up with fewer bugs inside of making it into our QA process. The pieces of our projects are more recyclable both inside of our projects and between different website builds themselves. It is easier to keep your website well optimized and performant across your different life cycle of a project. And yes, getting all this stuff is a huge pain in the ass to get it all up and running, which is why we made Mainspring, to help ease the pain of learning how to do all this stuff. And I hope that some of these pieces can be useful to you guys, either as a reference or maybe as the whole project. That would be awesome. But if you can pick and choose one of the elements that comes out of this and use it in your own workflow, then that would be awesome. What you're seeing here is like years of process and development sort of getting bundled together into one big package. So if you feel overwhelmed by this, just all I can say is go ahead and pick one thing that you think might be useful for you on your next project and dive into it and take a look on how it's working in Mainspring. If you have questions, post questions on the GitHub repo that's in there. We get bugs and ideas coming through in there as well, would be awesome. And so, just pick one thing and take it in baby steps. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, so this is awesome. Well done. So earlier on in the presentation, you had a prototype demonstrating some of the names on like the layouts.
Yep.
Where do you put the layouts? Do you stick those in the SC5 style guide as well?
Layouts. So we kind of we say so every partial file, the sort of internal rules are at least write a friggin' comment that this, make a style guide thing there, and you can be like header layouts here. It depends, right? Like the value of documenting, say, the header layout is kind of questionable because it's unique and custom to that particular instance of the website. You're never going to reuse it outside of the context of the header in this one and only one website. So we usually just write like layout header, which is very specific to that one use case. It is here, this lays out the header. But when it comes to like column layouts and stuff like that, where you want to reuse those are definitely something you can document in a much more useful way. So we just barf out a bunch of gibberish text and put the wrappers into it so that you can see how the layout's going to change for like multiple different column layouts and how the variations sort of look for different sort of column layouts or variations at different breakpoints and that kind of thing. So those are a little more useful when you can actually use it outside of one context.
Wait, so you mean that the HTML you put so that they show up as the two columns and you put in dummy text and you get your little mock-up layout in there?
Yeah.
Nice. Good.
And so layout, like column layouts, and so we've, if you can use sort of IE11 and above, then Flexbox becomes an available option. So it's actually, our layouts have become less complicated since we've moved to like Flexbox sort of approaches, but that's another place where you could definitely reuse things between projects, right? Because like a 4-column layout is, a 4-column layout. You might be adjusting where certain breakpoints happen and the padding and margins on things, but the same basic code is probably going to be pretty consistent between sites.
Is your slideshow accessible online?
Yeah, I tried to record this one. I have a different recording of it that's a sort of shorter version of that's a little more from earlier in the year. But yeah, it'll definitely be available online.
What visual regression tools do you use?
So for visual regression testing, Wraith.js is the easiest to run locally, and that's a really good tool. Backtrack.io, am I thinking the right one? Yeah, Backtrack.io is probably the best tool as a service that I'm aware of. So you make an account, and I think you can get a free account to run like 100 tests, 100 URL tests, which it sounds like a lot, but you actually kind of run out of it pretty quick if you're testing individual components in the user interface especially. But that tool is really awesome as well. So it's the easiest to use and get started with. Wraith is the easiest to get installed on your local machine, so you can use it on more like a dev sort of level. And then Casper.js and Phantom.js are sort of, if you need to start testing more complicated interactions where it's like, click on this and then something's going to pop open and we want to test to make sure that the dialog box looks right. That's where you have to move in. You know, Casper.js is probably that next level where you're kind of like, you're more like writing tests. Yeah, click events and assertions and all this stuff inside of that. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone.